Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Scott Keith, Adam Francisco, and Bruce Hillman. The Thinking Fellows is part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. There are a lot of podcasts at 1517, and there's also other content that you should check out that we link in the show notes. There are new articles that get linked to these show notes and are on the website every day. There are new videos that are on our YouTube channel, and there are conferences and books and so much more. Go to 1517.org or just scroll into the show notes of this episode to see the latest from 1517. And if you're enjoying the Thinking Fellows on here, don't forget to go over to the 1517 YouTube channel, subscribe there. We're putting more clips of the shows from podcasts on that general page, and then you can go find their standalone pages or podcasts. Okay, today we are going to talk about, I think, a topic we've never done before, which is rare, and we're going to do the Crusades. We're going to talk about Crusades. A couple of reasons for this. Adam was going to read some sort of, I don't remember which pope, but a declaration about Crusades.
Urban
right?
II. Yeah.
Urban II. And then there's, I would say online when it comes to, I don't know, the right wing, the Tradcaths, a whole bunch of other groups. There's like a bunch of references to Crusades, and what the most famous one right now would be the like sort of the Deus Vult tattoo controversy with what's his name, Peter Hegzeth?
Hegzeth?
Oh, yeah.
Hegzeth? Is that
Hegzeth?
Yeah, the Fox News guy.
The Fox News guy who Trump initially picked for, what is it? Was it Secretary of Defense?
Yeah, SecDef.
SecDef. Now, who knows if that'll actually happen. I think I saw some backpedaling. Who knows? But the controversy was he has this tattoo that's in reference to the Crusades and maybe views the United States as a Christian nation doing Crusades. No, by the way, I don't think I saw anything where he said that, so I'm not trying to but that was some of the implications I was seeing online. And so maybe it's a timely thing. I've seen Crusades pop up and off on Twitter and other places in one of two ways, either sort of like, Christians should conquer the world, or Christians really, really, really need to apologize and be so sorry that the Crusades happened. And I'd just be curious, what's the actual sort of take here? What did the Crusades actually look like? How apologetic does the church need to be or not that they exist or existed? And then what from there?
when your dad and I were in college, Caleb, when you were a wee little lad, I don't know how old was he in 1999?
It'd been 4.
I was 4.
4. There was this thing.
This is the year of birth I can remember for some reason. The other two, it's like all cloudy.
That's all of mine. I'm like, I have no idea. I have to do math sometimes, but then it gets a little confusing,
Your brain just looks like trigonometry calculations going off in your head, just trying to figure out a birth year.
Yeah. So then I just resort to texting one of the kids, "Hey, when were you born?" And they're like, "You still don't know?" And it gets really bad when I misspell their name, or I can never remember whether Kiana's middle name has a hyphen in it or not, or Elena's name has a U after the Q. And anyway, back in the 1999, Caleb, there was this thing. I don't know if you remember this, Scott. It was mostly a European thing, I believe, called reconciliation walks, and it was like this mass movement of Christians in Europe who would gather together at some of the more, like if you go to Cambridge, not that anybody would want to go down to Cambridge, but if you had to
I like
not
Cambridge.
go to Oxford and go to Cambridge, there's a round church there, which is one of the gathering places for Crusaders before they headed off to the Holy Land. And so these Christians in 1999 would gather together at these various churches where Crusades took off from, and they would like literally walk for weeks, months on end to the Holy Land as they got closer to Turkey and into the Western Mediterranean or the Levant, Syria and Lebanon. They would apologize to Muslims as they went along the way until they got to Jerusalem. So it was a big thing in commemoration of the 1,000-year anniversary of the First Crusades' successful wresting of Jerusalem in July. I think it was July 14th, but I might be mistaken there, of 1099 from Muslim hands after about, more than 500 years of Muslim/Arab domination of Jerusalem. So,
well, in evangelical circles, it's become pretty controversial for the Billy Graham organization, to refer to its revival meetings as crusades.
And Campus Crusade changed their name to Cru, and I think they've changed it again.
Sorry.
Yeah, and in the wake of September 11th, I remember President Bush, whom Scott loves, referred to the war on terror kind of synonymously with the Crusades, so it kind of revived all this old stuff. But it's in the wake of that, and now 20 years past, that every once in a while the Crusades pop up again as a controversy. And as you put it, Caleb, it's either you got some people like advocating for some type of crusade or some advocating for this mass apology from Christians, 1,000 years later, for apologizing for the Crusades. And then you got people in the middle who say, hey, let's just look at the Crusades and see what they really were about. When you look at them closely, first of all, it's a very, for lack of a better term, very diverse kind of thing. It starts as a response by the Pope encouraging Christians to take up arms, begin marching to the Holy Land, and rescuing and liberating Christians who have been persecuted for. So that would be like that was 1095 when he issues the First Crusade sermon. And they get into the Holy Land in the late 1090s, and for about 20 years, maybe a little longer, the Christians living in that territory, who had always lived in that territory, had been undergoing a pretty severe persecution at the hands of mostly Seljuk Turks, who were these Central Asian nomads who had embraced Sunni Islam and moved into the region. So basically, think of like Israel, Lebanon, and Syria today. And when they moved into the region, they looked around and saw, and these are new converts to Islam. They looked around and saw that the former rulers, the Arab Muslims, were treating Christians too well, allowing them too many liberties. They're allowing them to ring bells and wear crucifixes and things like that. And they said, this goes against Islamic law. So in a sense, they kind of, folded their hands, cracked their knuckles, and said, we'll teach those Christians a lesson. And then the persecution breaks out. Now, the material we have from that persecution right before the First Crusade is somewhat questionable. So it's hard to know exactly what was going on, but we have 5 redactions from Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in November of 1095, where he gives this First Crusade sermon where he recounts what's going on with Christians over in the East. And he says that Christians are being rounded up. They are being hung on crosses. If they're not circumcised, the Muslims are taking them into their churches, putting their stuff on altars, circumcising them, collecting all the blood, putting them in baptismal fonts, cutting pregnant women open, ripping out their children, and drowning them in these baptismal fonts. And then the guy, his name's Robert the Monk. He's probably the earliest redaction of this Crusade sermon, says that their favorite form of torturing Christians was to cut around the viscera, the belly button, to pull out the innards a bit, tie it to a stick, nail the stick to the ground, and start whipping them so that these people are moving around in their
graphic. I think we need a little warning before this.
Sorry. I get excited about this because I'm one of these guys who thinks that the Crusades were a bad idea generally, but they were totally rational and could be, at least the initial movement, could be justified in a weird kind of medieval sense as a just war. So, I mean, there's like awful stuff going on. At least that's in the historical record. What we have, that's what we got to work with. And so, I mean, for me, again, I'm not a proponent of the Crusades. I don't need to even take sides because they happened 1,000 years ago. But what's the Pope and what are European Christians to do when they're hearing that this is going on amidst their Christian brethren? Even though the East and West churches, they've now kind of separated since 1054 in the Great Schism, what are they to do? So
I kind of think that, like, you hear this kind of stuff, and you go, okay, the state has the authority of the sword and has the obligation to protect its citizens and can engage in warfare and a whole host of other things. So if the Crusades are an operation of the state,
well, so that's the weird thing. It's you're in the Middle Ages, you're in the 11th century, and
there's no state.
Yeah, I mean there are like
or of
there's
the
an
prince,
emperor,
or
there
of
are
the
kings,
magistrate,
and so on.
emperor.
Yeah, but they, in many ways, throughout the Middle Ages, there's this contest between the church and the state over who, because it's like a unilateral hierarchy. Just sort of, there's not like two kingdoms per se. There might be two realms, but it's a unilateral hierarchy. And the question is the emperor or the pope on the top?
Well,
and
there's 3 crowns on that, so we know what he thinks.
Well, and Adam, you said Cambridge itself was a gathering place for this. So this is even beyond what's considered the Holy Roman Empire at this point. This is making its way into England, which is, not part of that. Has its own. I mean, back in 1095, kind of weird king system, but still sort of king system in place. In this is all, like you said, this happened 1,000 years ago. It's an interesting history because, like you told us that Cambridge was often a meeting place to take off for the Crusades, and England's not part of that Holy Roman Empire in the same way, and has its own kind of, even at this point, interesting and weird king structure. And so I think that the funny thing to me is that Crusades as a historical topic are super interesting, and it's fun to get into the ways in which sort of the medieval world dealt with these kind of things, and sort of how political influence was exerted, and how that political influence was caught up with the influence of the church, and how the church could mandate and dictate priorities for political entities, and that would cause them to jump into action. It's interesting how we try to apply that to our day today, and I think, or how we try to apply this to sort of a weird idea of evangelism, which gets it all muddled. We have no comparison to this politically,
right?
We just don't. And so you can't like make an equation to say, well, America should go get involved in this, and it's a crusade, right? Because every weird and, in my opinion, bad dictate that we've had to go invade portions of the Middle East have been over the gospel of spreading democracy, quote unquote, to the world, and not the gospel. And none of it has really been about, a quote unquote Christian country going over to the Middle East to protect Christians. And if you try to spin it this way, you're just lying to yourselves. You're taking out all of sort of, I don't mean to get on my anti-war or hobby horse here, but like corporate interest and political interest, all of which have nothing to do with protection of Christians or the spreading of the gospel. I mean, you mentioned the earliest speech in 1095 that kind of ignited the Crusades, and it being about protecting persecuted Christians. But over the course, what is this last almost 300 years, right, Adam?
Yeah, depending on in the Holy Land up until 1291, and then there are crusades against like heretics in Europe and so on.
Sure,
yeah.
I mean, it's crusades against other Christians eventually.
Yep.
And this is, and just to put this in historical perspective, that means that supposedly a particular speech sparked a movement to go protect Christians in Arab countries where they were being persecuted that lasted longer than the history of our country.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right.
And,
That's like,
and was supposed to have like this unilateral focus that whole time, all of which is holy. I find that very hard to believe.
Well, no, that's there's like you said earlier, a ton of interesting things about the Crusades. That piece in particular is fascinating because what's generally called the First Crusade. There's even one that's before the First Crusade, sometimes called the People's Crusade, where it's just this mass hysteria. We're going to go slaughter Muslims, and they end up getting slaughtered in Asia Minor. But the First Crusade really is a war of liberation. But then thereafter, just like you suggested, all of a sudden they devolve into land grabs, all sorts of shifting alliances. And then it's a war of defense in the Holy Land as Muslims are taking back their territory. And then in the Fourth Crusade, and this still irks Eastern Orthodox Christians to this very day, as the Crusaders from Europe get to they're resting in Constantinople, getting ready to go to the Holy Land, and they're like, let's just sack Constantinople. So it's messy because it lasts for such a long period.
And so for our listeners that don't understand that, that's like so this would be like the Eastern Church is centered in Constantinople. It's like their Rome, right? And the Roman Church there are crusaders over that are ostensibly on behalf of the Roman Church, and they decide just to take the center of Eastern Christianity.
Yeah. But then it gets even better, Scott. The Pope excommunicates them for doing that, and they have to grovel to get back with it. It gets so stinking messy. And
I think
back to the.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Back to just to draw kind of the term that everybody likes to use now is to draw or come back full circle. That mentioning Peter Hexeth, that's a tattooed Deus Vult. In that First Crusade, Deus Vult translates God wills it. In some of the redactions, they have Pope Urban saying that not only does God will it, but that should be the slogan as you're slaughtering the
people,
the Turks. You should be yelling out Deus Vult. Now, I wonder. I don't know if Peter Hexeth has spoken to why he got the Deus Vult tattoo. Dan Price at 1517 has worship tattooed on his forearm. I don't know that. Like sometimes you get tattoos for whatever reason, right? I don't know that he really.
I think that one for Dan Price dates back to when he was a worship leader.
Yeah, but you get these tattoos that are a little odd, right?
Yeah, and then they're there.
Yeah, and so it could be that I don't. There's all these accusations made against Pete Hexeth. I have no clue about him as a person, but maybe speaking from experience, you're in the military, you're tying one on at the local base cantina, and you wander off base, and there's a tattoo parlor, and you're maybe sitting there going, "What should I get? This sounds like a good idea right now. Let's get Deus Vult, or let's get hey, here's a business card with the LCMS cross on it. Why don't you tattoo that on my chest?" So I don't know.
Who has one of those, Adam?
I don't know. But who knows what's up with that tattoo?
Purely hypothetical.
But I do know, like in the War on Terror, this is you pick this up from guys from like Jocko Willink. Everybody's probably familiar, or a lot of people are familiar with him. And I guess on the other side would be not on the other side, but what's the other real large podcast? Sean Ryan. They were fighting in the War on Terror, whether it's Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Iraq or ISIS later on. And these guys have witnessed some pretty awful, awful things, grown men slaughtering children. And the way they, in many ways, justified their presence there, because a lot of them got, like Sean Ryan, for example, he's now, after the SEAL teams, he went to the CIA and worked there. And he's now like wondering, like, why the heck were we even in Iraq, right? But they have those doubts or those questions when they're there, but they're facing such evil, and the way they justify it is with this sort of religious rhetoric. I don't know that Peter Hegseth is really like sees himself or saw himself on a crusade or anything like that, just to kind of try to put the best construction on.
Can we say that even if the United States was not waging a religious war, which by all accounts it wasn't when it did these things,
it certainly wasn't.
That its opponent though was, right? That these
Ooh,
these groups,
Caleb, you're going to get us canceled.
Were, fighting a religious war and are all the time. The land grabs in the Middle East outside of the West's influence are about religion. And
Adam can correct me though, but I think that's very, it's not untrue. It's just very narrow. I mean, that dismisses. So if you take, and again, Adam, please feel free to correct me here. I have very little experience with this.
I do feel free to do that.
That's good. That particular view puts aside our doctrine of sin in general. In other words, of course, if they're conducting a religious war on behalf of Islam, we would say that's sinful. But we also then sort of don't take all of the categories of our doctrine of sin, including all of the selfish intents of every sinner towards every action, and apply that there, because we're so busy on the upper level sin. Hey, they're conducting a religious war on behalf of Islam, and that's sinful. And then we refuse to say then that there are also people within that structure that are doing what they're doing because it's enriching them, because it's making their family more stable, because it gets them power, and all of these other day-to-day style sinful motivations that you could apply to every one of these people, whether it's like a despot that's ruling an entire country, or somebody who rises to the rank of, warlord and is getting enriched in multiple ways because of that. There you go, Adam.
Yeah. For real. For sure, I guess.
Okay. So,
Caleb is not wrong in that. So, like a group like Al Qaeda or ISIS, in their mind, their rationale, they are fighting a war, both defensive and offensive, in defense of or for the promotion of Islam, for the restoration of the integrity of Islamic territory, but it is driven by something deeper, like you said, Scott. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, don't you think that, of course, there's highly political motivations to these, but if you're somebody over there who, whether it's by your own choice or not, or the motivations of your own government or the other governments, don't you think there's some sort of religious, I don't know if experience is the right word, when the people you're fighting are, yelling Allahu Akbar and are bringing religion constantly to the front of the battle?
I do, but okay. This isn't the direction I thought this show was going to go, but let's do it anyway. Here's the thing, is that I do, but think of even the examples that Adam gave about the Americans who went there, who, why did they sign up in the first place to go do this? Well, they obviously received some sort of message from our government that made them believe in a cause. And that, I'm not saying that cause is expressly religious. In other words, it's not like got a liturgy and a completely intact belief system that takes them into a plane of spirituality or something like that. But it is a belief system. It was, I was alive. It was a belief system that propelled this country into going over to these other countries and exerting our influence through military force on those countries. Right? Presidents, congressmen, senators, people within cabinets got on TV and they made speeches about the moral necessity of going and doing these things for the sake of not just the United States, but for the sake of the world. Right? And convince the people to believe in something and to go through the sheer might of American military power, exert that belief on other people. I'm not saying it's the same. It's not the same. But you could see, taking this back to the topic, you could see how sort of this kind of rhetoric can spool up And it can be an expressly religious belief system, right? We're doing this for the sake of God. Or it can be a system of influence that we're doing this for the sake of our God, which is quote unquote democracy.
Yeah.
I think you're both sort of right. I found a little quote here, which is pertinent to this from a historian. He says, defending the Holy Land and protecting Christians in the time of need was seen as an act of loving one's neighbor. Bernard of Clairvaux commented on Muslim victories in the Holy Land and wrote, quote, if we harden our hearts and pay little attention, where is our love of God? Where is our love of our neighbor? End quote. While there were additional motivations for taking up the cross, opportunity for economic or political gain, a desire for adventure, or feudal obligation to follow one's lord into battle, or to become a soldier for Christ, the idea was to express total devotion to God. According to the historian Jonathan Riley Smith, taking up the cross was based on Christ's statement, whoever does not carry his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So underscoring this, priests encouraged participation in the Crusades by praising acts of devotion to God and invoking fear in people for the last judgment for their failure to act. So you got a lot going on there.
I'm going to blow Scott's mind in a minute. Okay.
What'd you say?
Yeah, you do.
You have a lot
I'm going to blow
going
Scott's mind. Yeah. Jonathan Riley Smith, Crusading as an Act of Love is the classic essay that really gets to the heart and soul of what the Crusades, what they were sold as. Because if you read the redactions of Urban II's Crusade sermon, towards the end, and I don't know if there's 5 of them, and I don't know if it's every one of them, but it's in at least a majority of them. Pope Urban II then promises, he encourages all these would-be crusaders to take upon themselves to sew into their mail shirts or whatever they're wearing a cross, to put a cross on their shield and march towards Jerusalem. And when they come back, put the cross on their back. But it gets even better, Scott. And I'm going to tie this into the Reformation here. Watch this. And then Urban II promises a complete remission of sin, an indulgence. And this might just be where we get the first practice of, this exchange. In exchange for doing something or paying something, you get complete remission of sin. But if you go on your way and you die in the way, or you make it back, whatever, as long as you go with pure intentions of liberating the Holy Land, regardless of what your fate is, you're promised a complete remission of sins. And so now that's thinking like, does everybody who participates in the Crusades actually, are they motivated for those reasons, or is it like Bruce that Jonathan Riley Smith puts it? There are other motivations too. Who knows? But the rhetoric is really quite strong, and so when you get to the Reformation, there are still crusades going on. The popes calling for crusades against Lutherans, crusades against the Turks, and so on. And
eventually he kind of gets one too.
Yeah, for sure. But then 1529, Luther writes this work called On War Against the Turk, which addresses from Luther's perspective the very issue of the crusade. And he had been asked about 10 years prior by his prince, hey, the Pope's calling for a crusade against the Turks. Should I support it? And this is pre-Reformation Luther. He goes, nah, we got our own house to clean up first. But then 1529, the Turks are at Vienna, and Luther writes that Germans are wholly justified in fighting the Turks at the gates of Vienna as an act of defense of their neighbor. In fact, Luther says this is a Christian act of love to do this. But if you're out there fighting against the Turk, and this rhetoric of God willing this and that you get a complete remission of sins, and even if you're out fighting the Turk and there's a bishop or a monk out there with a crucifix on a banner or a flag, Luther says, run from it as if it's the devil. So, theologically, the Crusades are a total mess.
Well, can I give like a kind of, I guess I'd say, a biblical background to this? The implication, if you're going out there with a sword, is that with a cross rather, is that you're out there to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. The implication, if you're going out there with a sword, is that you're out there to kill people. Now, the killing people could be a defensive neighbor, as in the case of defending Vienna, which I'm sure can be seen as a just war. You're defending against an invasion. But those two things are separate. You do not proclaim the gospel with a sword. Jesus, if you'll recall, reminded Peter of this the night that Jesus was arrested. That these two things are not the same thing, and I think that's why Luther says, "Run from this as if it's the devil," because it's the sword claiming to be the gospel, and the devil is the one that churns the gospel, the powerful message supported by the Holy Spirit, the power of the Holy Spirit, that you are free on account of Christ alone, you're saved on account of Christ alone, is not the same thing as protecting lands or taking lands, or certainly not killing people. And the devil is the one who turns the gospel into something that it's not. And oftentimes, most of the time, what he's doing is he's turning the gospel into something that you do that is meritorious. And so this is why you run from this. And this is why we as Christians, we cannot, whether or not politically the Crusades can be justified, whether or not they're part of quote unquote settler colonialism and all this other stuff, those are all interesting matters for debate. But what they are not, seems to me, are evangelistic missions to convert people over to the gospel of Christ Jesus.
Yeah. Can I blow your mind yet again, Scott?
Sure, go for it. But
I know this isn't blowing your mind, but in the Crusades to the Holy Land, about halfway through, I'm trying to remember who it was. Peter the Venerable, we talked about him a while ago. He doesn't deserve the title Venerable because he was never canonized, but he's one of the guys in the mix of this. As they're watching the Crusades, there's this abbot of this massive monastery, the chief Benedictine monastery in France, the monastery at Cluny, who says, "Hey, we're sending all these crusaders to kill these Muslims. We ought to be sending missionaries alongside or with them."
Yeah, there you go.
And so you do get it. It's a really interesting episode of Dominicans primarily, but Franciscans as well, are going to accompany crusading forces, and in various ways, depending where they are going to sometimes go out ahead of the crusading forces and try to evangelize the Muslims. Otherwise, they're after the crusaders conquer or retake land, then the missionaries will go about and try to convert the Muslims to Christianity. So it's really quite. You want to talk about what we would call the confusion of the kingdoms. This is like the primary example of it.
Yeah,
but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't really know everything about sort of what's going on with appointments and all that regarding this, but you have sort of heard this mentality lately of sort of Christian men like really trying to step up and be more forceful for Christianity, and which I like a lot. But at the end of the day, what they're normally talking about is sort of like Christian values and that type of thing. They're not really talking about what the gospel or evangelism or getting the gospel out. They're more talking about sort of getting the sense of Christianness out. And I guess let me do more scare quotes, quote unquote Christianness out. And this sort of breeds then sort of a view of masculinity that is strong and forceful, and all of which under moderation I'm totally okay with. But when this bleeds over to sort of these discussions that we as an American political system ought to continue this or see our work such as it is in the Middle East as sort of like a Christian project in some way, is just completely misguided. It is just completely misguided, and it doesn't take into account the complexities of the original Crusades, again, lasting longer than this country has been in existence, and obviously having multiple motivations throughout that time period. I mean, look at how much we've changed since the founding of this country. Could you say we've had a singular focus?
Are you saying that there are people nowadays who are justifying kind of America's foreign wars on Christian religious grounds?
I'm saying that my impression has been, if you transport yourself back to 2001, Bruce, did you not get that mojo from it?
I got a sense of like rabid patriotism after that.
Well, I'm saying is I probably watched more Fox News than you back then,
That's probably
and
true.
I definitely got a bit of a Christian mojo going on, quote unquote Christian mojo going on off a lot of that, and it's just I just think we should be careful of it.
I actually think it's worse. That Christian mojo portion is worse today in 2024. Now, I was really little in 2001, but
when you mean worse, you mean more prevalent, or do you just mean the same prevalence, but people. It's been more nefarious?
No. I think it's just more prevalent. It's the way people kind of talk about it, especially today. Not to kick the horse or the hornet's nest too much, but I think specifically with the fact that the United States is supposedly mostly out of the Middle East, and now the conflict is mostly around Israel, I'm seeing more Christians than ever say that there's a religious reason to be involved in these, specifically when it comes to the defense of Israel, the establishment of sort of the protection of Israel for religious reasons, and more people willing to use the word crusade when it comes to that. Now, again, I think that's just kind of a historical reminder or slogan. It's, like we said, Campus Crusades used this. Every other Christian school's sports team is called the Crusaders. There's some aspect
yours
to this.
Was.
Mine was. There's some aspect to this where it's like,
mine was too.
I get why the word is used outside of advocating for a real crusade. It has sort of just this colloquial meaning for Christian military activity, but or victory or something like this. I think particularly victory, but that's I don't know. I think, like, I get, just to get back to sort of the beginning and everything, to me this really is a kingdoms issue. Like, would I want to call it a crusade? Because I think history and the way people act with it prove that my dad is right, which is people then turn the sword into the cross. The Crusades are about converting via the sword. But I am for the defense of Christians by their governments and by their kings or rulers or whatever form of government that is, because I'm a Christian and my closest neighbors are Christians, and if the sword is going to be used to defend people like your citizens, so be it. That is the authority of government, the sword. But to call that a crusade forward is hard.
You don't need Christian theology to have that view.
I think that's true.
Personally, I mean, anybody.
I agree, Bruce. I don't think you need Christian theology to say that the states are established in part to defend their citizens. I completely agree with that. Well, I think Christians can confidently affirm that, right? Instead of taking a more dramatic pacifist stance as to say, like, no, Christians shouldn't advocate for their governments to defend themselves. We should just be okay with being defeated because Christ said, love your enemies. Kind of, really vanilla.
If you take at the end of the day what I think is Luther's stand that Adam was explaining, is it defense? What is a just war? It's defense at the end of the day. And whether that's defending your citizens that should be especially in our case, defending our citizens. Where what you said gets mucky a little bit for me is, does this, and we don't have time for it today, but does this mean that, like, we, the United States, have an obligation to go defend Christians who are being persecuted throughout the world? And I think this is just something that we don't do that on the whole, but sort of the idea that we should do that. Part of me wants to say, the Christian part of me wants to say, yeah, I mean, what better thing could you go do than go defend my fellow Christians? But the other part says, is that the role for our country?
Agreed. So I think there's a distinction between me, the American citizen, and me, which is weird. I'm not trying to say I have two hats, but it's like, if the United States, like, I would be much less upset if the United States was saying, yeah, we're going to go defend these people and also offer them refugee status and get them out of there so we don't have to kill as many people, whatever that solution may be. And the classic example to me would be the recent events in Syria, which every commentator in the United States has admitted is going to be worse for Christians there, that it's going to cause Christian death in Syria. Now, like, the fact that nobody cares bothers me deeply, but do I want the United States to be in another military conflict in order to in the Middle East? No. So I don't.
I think at the very least you could say we've done much worse for much worse reasons.
Sounds like what you guys really want is the return of the papal states, so the Pope can have all these battles for you.
That's what I want for sure.
Yeah, Bruce.
I mean, this is absolutely what I want for sure.
Love it.
I can't wait for it, actually.
They still have those Swiss guards with those, very colorful uniforms. Strike
They do.
fear in the hearts there.
Ridiculous, honestly. All right, how do we wrap this up?
We'll let Adam wrap it up.
How do you want me to wrap this up? I was going to tell you that, in San Juan Capistrano, where, Scott, you're in San Clemente, it looks like, but just up the road, there used to be, until before San Juan Capistrano started building up, there used to be a Catholic bookstore called the Crusade Catholic Bookstore. Up until just about 5 years ago. How do we wrap this up? So Crusades, totally understandable why they happened. Not a totally bad idea if you look at them in context, but theologically unjustifiable.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
And theologically,
politically, certainly.
Yeah, if you're trying to make a theological argument in favor of them, you have some heavy lifting to do with the Gospels, I'd say, and with the idea of, the fact that you can't, evangelism by the sword just isn't a thing.
I might say something like what Bruce said a bit earlier, kind of as a side comment, that you don't need, and I don't like really the way that sounds, but you don't need Christian theology to justify or explain or make it morally legitimate the notion that Americans or whoever go overseas to protect those who are being persecuted. That be they Christians or some other group. So, Caleb, your last comment about Syria, that will be interesting to see what happens there. It reminded me, and here hopefully I'm not bringing up another topic, but there's a book that came out maybe 6 years ago called Islamic Exceptionalism. And the author was a liberal-minded Muslim out of the Brookings Institute. I think Shadi Hamid is his name. He argues that Islam, the classical, traditional conception of it with the political ideal being there being a caliph of some sort, Islamic law, being the law of the land and so on, is here to stay. And that's what makes Islamic civilization unique or exceptional, if you will. And Western countries, as they think about how to handle things in the Middle East, need to take that into account as they do their calculus in terms of how they act. And that to me is a little, it's not frightening in that I'm losing sleep over it. But it does mean, Caleb, as you said earlier, that Christians will be on the losing end on this. We saw it in Iraq with the rise of ISIS, where Mosul, a predominantly, I think, majority Christian city, up until the rise of ISIS, now has very, very few Christians living in it. Many fled. A lot were put in cages, set on fire, decapitated, and so on. Sorry, I should have given a warning again there, too. But and that's not every Muslim. It's not every interpretation of Islam, but that is very much in keeping with the historical sort of trajectory of Islam. Christianity is at best or Christians are at best second-class citizens there. At worst, they're a heavily persecuted minority. And what irks me, here I'm going to get political for a moment, but I'm allowed to, right, Scott? Is the fact that now the United States is funding all this stuff and supporting all this stuff to the tune of what? Something like $80 million a week goes to the Taliban in Afghanistan. We're cool with a guy. We're kind of cool with a guy who's formerly of Al Qaeda, heading up Syria's new forming government. I mean, good heavens. But on the other hand, it kind of, there's a reason behind it, I guess, because America is no longer has, Christian interests are way off the radar of American federal government. Whether that's good or bad, I'll let Scott decide, or Caleb. You guys can argue over that in Big Bear.
I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good, but I think there's a deeper conversation about how much we, as the government of the United States, should be involved in any of this. And so why we have elevated ourselves to this role always confuses me a little bit, and has for 30 some odd years. So, but anyway, at the end of the day, the thing I'd like to end on is just that this is not the gospel, and that the gospel itself is a message of reconciliation that goes from a preacher to a hearer, not from a soldier to somebody being impacted by that soldier. Mm-hmm. It goes from a preacher to a hearer, and that the calling that Christ gave in the New Testament is to go out into the world and to preach his gospel. And the promise that he gave that would come along with that, one was a bunch of conversions to the gospel of Christ, and also a bunch of that the world on the whole was not going to like that message, and that the world on the whole would persecute that message, which is at the end of the day what take up your cross and follow me means. Is that you have two promises. The Holy Spirit will come through the proclamation of that gospel, and that the world is going to be pissed off by it, and the world is going to react with persecution. So it's to be expected. Unfortunately, but it's to be expected.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's the right distinction to end on for something like this. And I don't know, this is a fun episode, definitely different for us. So thanks, guys, for your time. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinking Fellows podcast. Don't forget to check out more of what's happening at 1517. We have just a ton of different content there that gets specific. It gets all the way to just verse by verse through the Bible, through a couple of our podcasts and articles and weekly stuff, to the topics like we do on Thinking Fellows, to just blogs that are both about theology and comfort and about things that are happening now. So go ahead, check out the show notes, go to 1517.org. Thanks for listening. We will catch you next week. Bye.